Joan Shannon. We're here together. Thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me.
Yeah, an exit interview.
Oh, so many times over the years.
You are stepping down from the City Council after how many years?
22 years.
Yeah. So what prompted this decision?
You know, it's funny. I really just felt like it was time. I think the last time I ran for City Council, I had sent out an email to people who had been past supporters and constituents, and I said, you know, what do you think? Do you think it's time? Because it does get to be time. There's a point at which even your supporters are going to say, you know, it's time for somebody new. And I had really strong support. There were a few people who kindly said, yeah, I think it's time. But ultimately, you know, I still wanted to do it. I still had the support. And this time around, you know, I didn't feel the need to go out and ask the question because I just felt like it's time for somebody new. And it's time, yeah, I think that it's going to be good to have somebody new in this role.
That can't be an easy thing to feel, that it's time for somebody new. I mean, what does that signal? What does that mean for you when it's time for somebody new to do what?
Well, it's kind of funny because I have been, you know, I continue to be very engaged, but I think somebody else can be more effective at this point. Even trying to do the same things that I have tried to do. I think that somebody else will be more effective. I think that over the years, and we've seen this with a lot of other people, the more that you do, the more you develop, you know, kind of the high negatives. If I did nothing, I probably wouldn't have high negatives. But
explain to me what high negatives are.
Well, people have strong opinions one way or the other.
About you or about your political
me,
positions,
about positions that I've taken.
Yeah.
And I think that if you're less strident, if you're less out there, you go a little bit unnoticed and you don't get those kind of high negatives. And those, you know, then people start reacting to the person rather than what you're saying, rather than to the issue. And I didn't, you know, I think I have been effective in the time that I have been here. But I think at this point, somebody else can step in and try to do the same things that I've tried to do, or it'll be new things because it's always new issues. You know, we always campaign kind of on the same things, and then some new issue comes up you never anticipated. But I think that having somebody else come in with a fresh slate and a fresh perspective is going to be good for the city. And honestly, I never did this for me. You know, I did this. You know, I really saw it as service. I tried to step up for the city and do the best for the city that I could do.
Yeah, take us back to when you first considered this. What was your first campaign, and when did you throw your hat in the ring? Who often you get recruited by somebody?
Yeah, no, I was the person recruiting people because I felt like I was not satisfied with the representation at the time. But I had a baby, you know, like a 6-month-old baby. And there was no possibility in my mind that I was going to run for city council. I was a business owner, a small business owner. And my husband worked at IBM and he traveled a lot. And he traveled to like Asia. So he was gone a lot of the time. And there was no practical way for me to serve on city council. And I tried to recruit several people, and in that process, a couple women came up to me as I entered an NPA meeting holding that baby, and they said, would you run for city council? And I said, basically, that's ridiculous. I have a baby, my husband travels, and they said, we'll babysit.
So wait, you're going to NPA meetings with a 6-month-old baby. What's the drive in you there to be involved in your community?
There were a lot of things going on at the time. There was the Southern Connector, Champlain Parkway that was really impacting my neighborhood. Now it's gotten built and it impacts my neighborhood. There were other community issues. Like I really believe in community, in living in community. I had organized a neighborhood fair and had gotten camps. Every kid who came to the fair, I live in a low-income neighborhood. A lot of the kids in my neighborhood were really idle during the summer, which is often not good. And you know, other neighborhoods, these kids were going to camps, and my neighbors didn't have that benefit. So every kid in the neighborhood got free camp for participating in the events of this neighborhood fair. And so the NPAs was another source of being part of the community, of being up to date on what's happening, on weighing in and shepherding democracy. You know, if I think that we put a lot of emphasis on our obligation to vote as a democratic society. We don't put enough obligation on us to all really participate, be active participants in our democracy. And I've always believed in that.
Where did those foundational values come from? Did you get radicalized when you went to school? Did it come from your family of origin? Were you organizing neighborhood kids as a...
I would say I was never radicalized. I was maybe a radical.
Well, it can be radical just to be involved in community change making, right?
Yeah, I mean, I remember I had a great teacher in 5th grade who taught us the basics of government. You know, things like the different branches of government, how a bill becomes a law. And from that point, I was always very interested. I was a government major in college. And I just really believed at my core that government should work for the people that we represent. And that's all I ever really wanted. I didn't have an agenda like wanting a specific thing done, though I did not like the Champlain Parkway. But when I ran, I realized I couldn't run to just fight the Champlain Parkway because there were people in the district who felt like their life depended on this road being built, and others who thought their lives would be ruined by this road being built. And so that was kind of the first thing that I had to navigate is how do you represent these opposing sides in our community? And I did vote no on the Champlain Parkway in the early years, but I continued to try to find solutions to make it better, to do something that would serve those, you know, like the residents on Flynn Avenue and Home Avenue and parts of Pine Street that were really negatively impacted by heavy truck traffic on their neighborhood streets. And how do we address that while at the same time not having the negative impacts of the roads? And some of that was ameliorated, not completely. I'm not thrilled with it, but that's something I have wrestled with for the entirety of 22 years. And, you know, this year, here it is.
Do you at least understand it? You understand the parameter? You must live inside and outside of understanding the Champlain Parkway.
I definitely understand the Champlain Parkway, yes.
Yeah. So did you start running as a Democrat when
I first was thinking about running, I didn't like to be, you know, in Burlington we had the Progressive Party. My politics were very liberal. And I I would never give to the Democratic Party, you know, when they would call up and solicit donations, I would never give to the Democratic Party because I was afraid that they would be working against the progressives. So I thought myself enough of progressive that I didn't want to be giving to anybody who might be working against the Progressive Party. But when I decided to run, the person who held the seat was a progressive. So I wasn't going to be running as a progressive. And I kind of wasn't.
Remind us who is?
It's actually Richard Kemp.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So you ran your first run was against Richard Kemp.
Yes.
That's a tough battle.
Yeah, nobody thought I would win.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I decided I wanted to run as an independent, but I reached the conclusion that with a baby, I couldn't, I needed party support. I had no idea how to run for office. And I needed the support of a political party. Barbara Perry was on the council at the time, and I think I reached out to her to find out, how is it to run as an independent? And I never regretted that. I was worried that I would be pigeonholed, required to vote a certain way. Lo and behold, the Democrats are the party of, trying to herd cats. It's a big tent party. There was always room for a diversity of opinion in the room and a respect for that, which I've appreciated over the years.
Yeah. Burlington in this region is one of the only places that has a party system. What is the benefit, besides having this structure that helps people run for office? What's the benefit to Burlington politics in having a party system?
I am not going to claim that there is a benefit to Burlington in having a party system. There's been a couple times over the years that a resolution has been put forward to take away the party status. And I think I was on the committee that was referred to the first time. It was either the Ordinance Committee or Charter Change Committee. And I didn't support it, honestly, because the party that got me elected did not support it. And I think the same was true of the Progressives. The Progressive Party wouldn't exist. And so the Progressives felt strongly they wanted that party title because it established Burlington is a lot of what helps establish the Progressives as a party and identify them as a party. And I really just voted that way more out of respect for the work that people did to get me elected and the strong feeling within the party that they wanted the party status, and came up a couple times. And I'm not convinced that there's a benefit. But the one thing I will say on the positive side is that if you don't have a party title, then what do you know? There's a lot of not very informed voters, right? And if you don't have a party title, what do you know about the person from the ballot? It used to have our address. It doesn't even have our address anymore, and it has our name. Well, then you're only left to judge by a name. And some people will choose to vote for the Irish person on the ballot. Some people will choose to vote for or against somebody who sounds foreign. And so a party title does give a little bit of information to the voter.
So talk from your experience of being in this position, from sitting on the city council for 22 years as a Democrat. And we have really, the Republicans have very little sway at this point. There's nobody on the council. What are the fundamental differences between the Progressives and Democrats? And if you can take us back to when you ran against Richard Kemp, who was, one of the leaders in the Progressive Party at that time, certainly. What were the fundamental differences that you were running or that you feel between these two parties?
Well, I think he had kind of narrow things that he was interested in and less interested in the broad range of things that the council has to address, which was kind of my frustration. But the difference to me is really pragmatism versus ideology. And so the ideology is probably something that I share, like in terms of the goals and what I value and maybe where we want to go. But I have had to take, and I believe in taking, practical approaches to try and advance the city. And that, there's been a few times in our city's history where we have acted very recklessly. And I blame that as being, partly on being too ideological and not practical enough. I think that the two big things would be Burlington Telecom and defunding the police. You know, those, in my 22 years, those are the two things that have really scarred Burlington. And we, fortunately, were able to get out of the Burlington Telecom debacle. That took a lot of very hard work on the part of, I would say, particularly David Provo, who led the Burlington Telecom Blue Ribbon Committee, Pat Robbins, and Mayor Weinberger, really, and community members who came to our rescue, Trey Pecor, who gave us a bridge loan at a time where we had no options.
So you think of, so you're in this case thinking of the Democrats as the pragmatic party and
Correct.
the progressives as being more ideological party.
Yeah.
And yet building Burlington Telecom is also a pretty pragmatic, could be considered a very pragmatic approach to solving a community's need for municipal.
Yes, it was, and that was bipartisan.
And telecom continues to be a pretty successful business. So I'm curious how that connects with the...
I think that, so that was bipartisan, starting Burlington Telecom. And we did it, a lot of people forget this piece of history, and it's a nice time to kind of reflect on the history. We did it because there was nobody who had an interest in providing us that kind of internet access that we decided to build for ourselves. But I think the pragmatic side was, you know, a real progressive push to keep it community owned at a point in time when we never owned Burlington Telecom. It was leased, and the lease had come due, and it was Citibank who owned the equipment in our ground, and they were threatening to pull the equipment out. And they told us very specifically that the community ownership option was not an option that they would take. And that continued to be the push of the Progressive Party, that it had to be community owned, which just was not a practical solution. It didn't get us out of the hole we were in. So we had to, and that was, you know, those were very hard times. I didn't agree with the ultimate solution, but we needed to sell it to somebody who would get us out of the lawsuit with Citibank.
So when you say you didn't agree with the ultimate solution, you know, you spent some time as the city council president. Mm-hmm. You've seen a bunch of city council presidents. How would you, if you were in a leadership position and you ran for mayor, right? And you're watching the new mayor, who's a progressive, take over leadership. What solution would you have seen? What would you have liked to see
with Burlington Telecom?
And then let's talk about kind of, you know.
Oh, you're asking me to come out against my friends now, but Burlington Telecom, we had a couple options on the table that we were to choose between, and that night we came up with an option that wasn't on the table, and that's ultimately what we pursued. So I didn't agree with that process.
That was a pretty.
It was awful.
It was pretty emotional on that.
Yes, yeah, tough.
It's in the archives here somewhere. We have it recorded. Yeah.
Yes. One of the very most contentious meetings I've ever participated in certainly was that night. And my biggest objection was to the process and how that all played out. I preferred another owner, Ting, and Ting would have developed really a new system that we would have had local cellular service tied to the broadband that we were providing locally. And so it was an opportunity to be on the cutting edge of something. Where we ended up, in hindsight, it's all good, it's fine. Burlington Telecom remains a wonderful product and serves the needs of our community. So,
were you council president? Who was council president?
I was not council president at that time. I think it was Kurt.
Or Jane?
It was Kurt or Jane.
Yeah.
I think it was Kurt.
So, I mean, this leadership is a big part of that. I mean, sometimes it's just the way the winds are set and, you know, why things happen, but leadership is a big part of that. Certainly 22 years is a form of leadership just in longevity, but also your time on council. What have you learned about this change-making process and community leadership in your time?
Oh, I've learned so much, probably because I started out so very green. You know, I thought that when I first came on the council, I certainly thought that what we needed was everybody to think like me, you know, and I quickly became appreciative of the disagreement and how much that adds to the conversation. And one of the first votes was for Board of Finance. I think that was, you know, literally probably the first vote that I took on the city council. And I supported my colleague who was in the financial business to serve on the Board of Finance. At that time, we only had 3 counselors. We now have 4, but at that time we had 3 counselors on the Board of Finance. And I couldn't believe it was only me and that counselor who voted to put her on the Board of Finance. And that was because there was already a Democrat on the Board of Finance because our council president was a Democrat. And the other Democrats voted to put a Republican on and a progressive so that we would have the full spectrum of council representation on the board. And I quickly learned why that was important. That meant that when things went to the Board of Finance, they came back fully vetted from a variety of perspectives, and that the most important thing wasn't actually that financial background, it was having the variety of political perspectives at the table.
So you wouldn't have to hash it out in full council.
Yeah, things could get
the issues,
resolved
yeah.
in the subcommittee.
What are some other places that you've seen that, like, differences of opinion come forth and bring something out better than would have existed without that conflict?
We have a lot of conflict in Burlington, and a lot of it is not terribly productive. It can really paralyze us sometimes. So I think that, yes, sometimes it's a process where we end up with something better. Burlington Telecom certainly involved a lot of compromises throughout the many years of that process. But there were also times when, you know, I think about City Hall Park and, you know, a desire to bring that to the voters at the very last stage of the process, after we had so many votes, after we had already invested so much money, and we had, you know, and it was really a debate about trees rather than this larger perspective on the park. And we ended up not putting that on the ballot. Now, in hindsight, I think that there could be some argument about the amount of money that we spent on the park, and then, you know, things that have happened in the park since. But I don't think we can let our disagreements and process paralyze us. So there are points in time where I think that, you know, we still have to move forward, even though we don't all agree. We can't have consensus on everything. And I've found over the years that where there's a contentious issue, and ultimately my constituents don't agree. You know, I want to represent my constituents, but I'm representing people like with the Champlain Parkway that don't agree with each other. So how do I do that? And the best that I've been able to do is make sure that I am well informed on the contentious issues, that I really do know the Champlain Parkway, what it does and what it doesn't, and those traffic studies, and where are the real problems. Because when people are against something, they'll throw all the spaghetti at the wall, and some of it is right and true, and some of it is just spaghetti on the wall. And you have to sift through that to find where the truth lies. And I've always seen that really as my job, is to try and figure out, you know, where the truth is. And there can kind of be conflicting truths as well, of course. the Parkway always was going to benefit some people and not benefit others. And the best that I can do is be as informed as I can be, make the changes that can be made, fight for those changes that make it better. And there were a lot of things that happened with the Parkway that made it better. And then go back and explain why I came down on the side that I came down on, which made half the people happy and half the people angry.
Are there decisions like that that you look back on now and go, oof, I wouldn't have done that. I would do that differently.
Definitely.
Do you want to talk about that?
They tend to
Will
be.
you?
There were, the ones that come to mind are kind of smaller issues. I remember we had, there was, Burton Snowboard had some really offensive graphics on their boards. And so constituents came to me and they were very upset about the graphics on these boards and how it, when people see these things in public, how it affects them. And so we came out with a resolution against the graphics on Burlington, on Burton's snowboards. And Russ Ellis made a great speech that night about free speech. And I have always wished that I've listened to Russ Ellis that night and had not voted against the graphics on a business's snowboards. There was something else that just came to mind too.
Well, you faced a lot, and if it comes to mind, please jump in, but you faced a lot of really personal attacks for your political views. And I think that's something like, how do you manage that in a leadership position in a small community? I mean, I think sometimes we see that happen at a national level or even maybe on a statewide level, and folks feel isolated from it. But here, insulated, that's not, but here in a community level, what's that felt like for you to?
And there were, I was the chair of the Charter Change Committee when we were going through this defund the police movement. And also, there was a desire to have an oversight board that would have, it was set up to be anti-police, which wasn't going to treat the police fairly. And so I stood up to that when there was just truthfully, I felt like there's a lot of hate in our community around that issue in defense of what is right, which is anti-racism. But when you take it too far, and it's like they needed a villain, and I became that villain. There was nobody to the right, and I was the one speaking on this issue. There were plenty, I had colleagues who voted with me on the issue, but I was the one speaking to it. I was the voice of it. And those were very hard times, but somebody had to speak up and say the truth, and I, to the best of my ability, did that. Mm-hmm. And I took the heat for that. And what I learned in that process, interestingly, was there were a lot of people afraid to say they agreed with what I was saying, but they were afraid to say it. And they saw what I was putting up with, and the depth of gratitude in the community was really deeper than people know. And what they saw on the front was a lot of hate coming to me, with the stickering and the social media and city council meetings and all of that. It was very loud, but what people didn't hear was that there was an equal or greater amount of love coming to me privately from people who, I'm not talking about my friends, of course, my friends and my family are going to be with me, but people who they really came out of the woodwork mm-hmm. in support of me to express their gratitude. To lift me up. And I am aware, today we see some hate coming towards some city council candidates, and, not for legitimate reasons. And I really think Burlington has to I hope people focus more on the issues rather than the people.
Yeah. So, I mean, you've used the term defund the police a couple of times, and I know that that is a term of art that has been thrown about. I've also heard it reframed that Burlington didn't actually defund the police, right?
Well, there was a call to defund the police. Burlington's response to the call to defund the police, and what was called defunding the police at the time, was our decision to reduce the police department by attrition and to cap the number of police officers in our budget.
I just wonder, from your point of view, would you say Burlington didn't defund the police, the capped, or how would you characterize it? How would you characterize the action?
I usually characterize it as we demoralized and diminished the police department in response to the call to defund the police. And the defund the police movement was always about giving less money to the police and giving more money to social services. And we didn't, the police department diversified. It had already, it had already diversified. We always had community service officers. We had, I think, one CSL, community support liaison, and who is kind of a social worker in the police department. We had those prior to 2020, but we invested more in those non-sworn, unarmed police department personnel, and less on the sworn side in that process to answer that call. So that was our version. That was our response to defunding the police. The department didn't get less money, but they were spending their money in different ways. It became very costly, though, because when you had fewer officers and you have to pay these officers overtime now to cover the shifts, it never really saved any money. I also don't think that what the community really wanted, I think what the community really wanted was slow policing, police that could take the time to de-escalate. And unfortunately, I don't think you get better service by defunding anything or doing it with fewer people. I think actually what we want is better policing, which requires more investment. And I think it's also right to diversify the services and recognize that, particularly with mental health calls, I mean, those are the worst calls for the police department. And the social workers say, we need the police department with us. We actually need to send both.
Yeah. I mean, looking back at that, so you served during the pandemic, you served during the time of, I think many 8-hour-long meetings over the council's time, right? You're there many late hours. How do you handle those kinds of conversations that are going to impact our community, that are going to be divisive? I mean, the apartheid-free Burlington, that came forward, didn't get on the ballot. Is that one of the issues that is now coming up as a divisive issue?
Yeah, that was a big issue during the mayor's campaign. Very divisive, and.
But these are important. I mean, they're big issues that are important to.
That was an issue unlike the police issue or unlike Burlington Telecom. That's a global issue.
Yeah.
And so in terms of the function of the city, I don't think that that's necessarily. It is a big issue, but it's not related to how we run the city. But there's one thing you touched on, Meghan, that I wanted to, it's something I wanted to share that not a lot of people know, which is about the pandemic. And I think going back to maybe 2009, we had to approve an emergency response plan. And so I actually read the emergency response plan. I think it's something that is usually just rubber stamped because city councilors go, what do we know about emergency response? You know, the people who know about this have written it. And so I read it and I said, there's nothing in here about a pandemic. And at the time, nobody understood what a pandemic was. And so I pressed and I pressed, and finally they agreed to put the word pandemic in next to fire, flood, and hurricanes. And I said, but the response to a pandemic is not the same. It's not how do you evacuate your community, or it's how do you address your workforce when everybody is getting sick? How do you prevent the spread of disease? How do you deal with assuring that when people are sick, that you can still get the essential work of the city done? And so I did a show that you can dig out of your archives now. I think it was 2010.
Cool.
And I did a show with our fire chief, Seth Lasker, and Wendy Davis, who was the secretary, she was the governor's, I forget what the title is, Secretary of Health.
Okay.
Was it Health and?
Health and Human Services?
I don't think it was Health and Human Services, but she was in charge of public health. And so we did a Channel 17 show to talk about pandemic in 2010.
Interesting.
And
yeah.
I never could get, I wasn't an expert, and I recognize that. I could never get it into our emergency response plan in an effective way. And so when the pandemic hit, it's still, we all now know that you don't deal with a pandemic the same way you deal with a fire or a flood or a hurricane.
Yeah.
But I think
thinking
that,
about it.
Yeah.
How
and I
did
think
the
that
city? How do you think the city dealt with it?
Well, by the seat of our pants. And I think that the mayor and the department, that's one thing really underappreciated in this city is city staff. I think the mayor did an excellent job of leadership, and but city staff and the way that they stepped up to do anything and everything that was asked of them was just amazing. And recently somebody shared with me that in the beginning, they were all meeting in one room. Well, that is something that could have been headed off if we had an emergency response plan for pandemics, because after a while of, every department head in the city or a bunch of the leaders of the city meeting in one room, they realized, ooh, maybe we shouldn't do that. But they figured it out, and we got through those difficult times. And in hindsight, we can look back. There's so much we didn't know. We were told in the beginning, as you might recall, that masks were going to kill us, right? That we didn't know how to properly use an N95, so we should not be. Now, the reality was they wanted to save them for medical personnel, which was right. But what they told us, you don't know how to use N95s. And so we're making all these cloth masks, and I was, part of the group that was, getting
Sewing.
I wasn't sewing, no. I was managing people who were sewing, and working with Gene Richards from the airport and Brian Lowe to make sure that we were getting masks made and distributing them where they needed to go. You remember early in the pandemic, it was nursing homes that were hit really hard.
Yeah.
So we did what we could. We've all learned a lot. And actually, I remember telling Kurt Wright, who is council president, we can't meet. We can't have our last city council meeting was not in person. That was the first city council meeting we ever did on Zoom. And nobody had any idea how to meet without, or not, nobody knew, but we city councilors, when I first called up Kurt Wright and I said, I don't think we can meet, I then called Lauren Glenn, and Lauren Glenn told me there was this thing called Zoom.
Yeah.
Because my idea was that that we would connect through CCTV.
Yeah.
But then Lauren Glenn explained Zoom, and I think there was another one. I think it was probably Teams that she was talking to me about. But we went with Zoom, and then we all had to figure out how to use Zoom.
Yeah. How to make your cameras work and audio and.
Yes. Yes, but that was that's thanks to Lauren Glenn and the knowledge that you had here.
I mean, we have a continuity of operations plan, and part of it was being able to pivot and turn and support community members and municipalities through that time. So
that was so critical.
It was Lauren Glenn, but it was also some of the tech staff here. Again, the folks who knew how to do that work, and find a technological fix.
Yes.
Do you have, you seem like a pretty optimistic person.
Well, that's funny. I was editor of my high school yearbook.
Yeah.
And so I was the person who calculated, when your class voted on, the most athletic, the funniest, blah, blah, blah. I tabulated all of that. And we had 3 categories, which was most realistic, most optimistic, and most pessimistic. I was 1 vote away from getting most pessimistic, and I was 1 vote away from getting most optimistic, and I won most realistic.
So I guess that's a pretty pragmatic place to be.
And I think that remains true today. I think that you can see me through any of those lenses, but yeah, ultimately, I think because I'm a realist, maybe sometimes I look like a pessimist and sometimes I look like an optimist.
Yeah. Well, I mean, thinking back to the question of the police and how to rebuild trust in the community, how to meet community needs, how do you feel about Burlington's downtown now and then this new shift to Sean Burke coming in?
I think Sean, I give the mayor a lot of credit for that. I think that Sean Burke is going to be great for our community, for our police department. I think it's going to lift their spirits. I think that it will help with hiring. I also don't think that our only problems downtown are policing. Our police have done an amazing job despite their small numbers, but when you see people even committing violent crimes who are arrested, and then go to court and they're released and they commit more violent crimes against innocent people. That is really, I think that we have a broken system. And it isn't just police. We have an absolute crisis with mental health care and substance use disorder and an inability for people to get the help that they need. And then when they get help, they don't get the support that they need afterwards. And we're paying the price in our downtown for broken mental health system, broken treatment system, and broken criminal justice system all at once. And I know, ideologically, people will put their money on one or the other, or more emphasis on one or the other, but it is all part of it, and it's all broken. And those are not issues that, our role at the city level, I really think, is working with other communities to make sure that our state, and until a few weeks ago, I would always say the federal government, but I have no hope for them at the moment. In supporting us, we need the state to provide the safety net system that our community has had in the past, that they deserve. I certainly have family members who have been in situations like many people who are living on our streets today. And they had the good fortune of not being in Burlington, Vermont today. They were in a place where they could get the treatment that they needed and get the supports that they needed coming out and live a difficult but decent life.
Mm-hmm. What's next for you? you're stepping down, but you're not retiring. You're still
Well,
here, part of this
I
community.
am a realtor. I have been a realtor actually for 15 years. And I will be putting a little more focus on that than I've been able to in recent years. But also, I think that I'll be, seeking to find my voice in a different capacity. It has been a lifetime, literally a lifetime, my daughter's lifetime that I have been doing this. It's been part of our family culture and identity. And I have been pondering what kind of ex-city councilor am I going to be, because I've seen a lot of people leave over the years, and I've seen people completely detach. I've seen people not detach, everything in between. And, I don't really know yet, but I think that I will be finding my voice, and I had a lot of desire to participate in our community discussions prior to being a city councilor, and it's only more so now.
Well, thanks for joining us, Joan. Thanks for telling us a little bit about your journey and your way to get here. And
yeah, thanks so much for the opportunity, Megan, and thank you. Thanks to everybody at Town Meeting TV. The work you're doing here is so important to our community, and as we just talked about, we especially learned that during the pandemic. It's an essential service.
yeah, thanks. Well, we really love to be able to do this and love to be able to have conversations with folks like you. So thanks, and thanks for watching, folks.